Hey folks, good to see you. Thank you for joining us. For those of you that don't know me, my name is Reverend John Roberts. I'm the vicar of the church just behind us here called St Stephen's here in Southmead, Bristol. This is a short, informal reflection both on today being Father's Day. We're thinking a little bit about the prodigal son, reading from Luke 15, and also we're carrying on our Romans sermon series today, thinking about Romans 3 verses 9 to the end in particular. This is for anyone is welcome to join us. Thanks for watching. Cheers. Now, I know the prodigal son from Luke chapter 15 is a story that many of us will have heard again and again and again. And often we're encouraged to think about things like, which one of the two sons are you? And things like this. There's the one son who thinks he's in the right, and there's the one son who's done a lot wrong. But the thing is, as I see it, is not really about either of the sons. It's all about the father. Who is the father in the story? God. This is a story about who God is, about the nature of God. As I said, this is from Luke chapter 15. And chapter 15 has got three different parables in it. The first is the parable of the lost sheep, and it's the parable of the lost coin, then it's the parable of the prodigal son. And all these stories are about God the Father and God's love for us. They're all about how God treats God's children. And each time, if I'm honest, these parables are perhaps almost a little bit embarrassing. The parable of the lost sheep and the lost coin are about someone defying human wisdom, if you like, and going after one that is lost, leaving all the rest behind. It might seem a bit reckless. It's not what a sensible person would do, is it? It's perhaps not a wise, human, worldly way to behave. Yet, Jesus makes it abundantly clear that this is how the love of God works. God will defy our humanly limited rationale and go out of his way in his kind of utterly powerful divine nature to save the one who is lost. Without a doubt, the way the father in the prodigal son reacts to his second son would have been incredibly embarrassing in its context. Here we have a Jewish man, head of the family, head of the household. He's an owner of land, an owner of livestock, an owner of slaves. He's wealthy, well-to-do, upstanding Jewish man. It would have been embarrassing to see him acting so emotional and so generous to a son who had squandered so much of his wealth so unwisely and who had deserted him. Make no mistake, this is not a story saying that God is an idiot. It says that God the Father's love cannot be restrained. It knows no bounds. It will rejoice fully when one of God's children comes back to him. And we are taught by Jesus to call this God Father. This is the kind of Father that we have in God. We all of us obviously have a human father. And in today's kind of more complex family arrangements, some of us might have more than one. For good, for bad. A positive, warm, loving father who's an inspiration and a rock to us later in life. For some, perhaps, For others, it might be an absent presence, a number of different negative presences, an instiller of bad habits, or even an abuser. That's the very real situation that many throughout the world today and throughout human history have faced in their father. A father who hasn't been there for them the way that we needed. But we also have a God that we are encouraged to call Father, who behaves in the way that we see in the prodigal son. Reckless, abundant, unrestrained joy at a repentant sinner who returns to him. In the reading from Romans that we have this week, chapter 3, beginning at verse 9 through to the end of the chapter, we're very much carrying on from where we left off last week. A number of us have been reflecting on last week's reading throughout this week and have come up with various words of sorrow and pain and hurt around the idea of the fallenness, the brokenness of the world, around the idea of sin. And this goes right the way back to chapter 1, verse 18. And from there, really through to the middle of this Sunday's reading, around about verse 20 of chapter 3, Paul is just continually unpacking this idea of sin, the fallenness, the brokenness of the world, the way that God's people have not lived in the ways that God has asked them through the law and has turned away from God. Paul has been talking a lot about both Jews and Gentiles in relation to this falling short of the ways of God. And it's beginning to almost feel to me like an insurmountable problem, if you like. The way that humans have fallen short of God's ways, which we see in all the hurt and the pain and the brokenness in the world around us today. Paul is really keen to argue that this failing of the Jewish people, if you like, does not mean a failing of God. The failing of the Jewish people does not mean a failing of God, nor of God's work throughout history, which we read in the Old Testament. Paul wants us to realise that the Jewish people got it wrong, not God. That God's offering of Jesus is another outrageous offering of love from God to us and all of creation. It's not a do-over, it's not a fresh start. It's a continuance of what God has already been doing. The reason that Paul might seem so harsh on the Jewish people is that they were entrusted with this message from God. God's righteousness, the message of God's righteousness, the message of how God wanted his people to live. And the Jews were supposed to take this out to all nations. Instead, they kept it for themselves. They made themselves feel superior because they had this message. And they judged others and even one another really quite harshly for falling short of this great message. In short, the Jews, because they had the law, the ways that God wanted them to live, the Jews knew what sin was, and they sinned anyway. And that's why Paul is so harsh on the Jewish people and himself as well. And if he seems so harsh on the Gentiles, it's merely because he has all his life seen them as a people that do not know the law. They do not know what is morally right. And therefore they have always behaved in ungodly ways. But then we get this big but now in chapter 3 verse 21. But now. And as I was saying, it might have been feeling that this problem of sin, the problem of the brokenness and the fallenness of the world, whether of the Jewish people not taking this great message of God's ways out into the world, or the Gentiles having not heard it. It might have felt like this was an insurmountable problem, the way that Paul is building it up. But here in verse 21, in fact, these few little verses, 21 to 24, we get again a little snippet of how Paul understands the gospel and how the gospel solves this problem for all. He says, apart from the law, so that means completely separate from the law, the righteousness of God has been disclosed. So it's not just for those who have the law. He says the righteousness of God, that's the goodness and the justiceness of God. Through faith in Jesus Christ is for all who believe. He says, for there is no distinction, and again he's meaning here between the Jew, the Gentile, for those who know the law, for those who follow it, and for those who don't. There is no distinction, since all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God. Those are now justified. They're made right in the eyes of God, even though they've sinned and fallen short. They are all now justified by his grace, which is a gift. It's freely given. There's no small print, no secret clauses. It's a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ. That is, again, a lovely couple of very dense verses with lots of stuff packed in there. Verses 21 to 24 in chapter 3, which really gives us a snippet, a view of Paul, how Paul understands the gospel. And that, I think, goes together really well with the image that we get in the prodigal son story. It's a wonderful image for this idea that Paul is at pains to communicate to all who hear him. That, yeah, God has given a lot to God's children. A lot of wealth has been given to God's children. And the two children in the story, the first and the second son, they respond to that wealth in two very different ways. And we can understand that wealth for us today as maybe as the gospel message which we have been called to proclaim afresh to every new generation and to take to the corners of the world. Or we might want to understand the wealth that's been given to us as all the blessings that we have in our life, in the world around us. That God has given a lot of wealth to all his children, but that the one who recognises how much they fall short of what God wanted of them, yet still, in utter repentance, approaches God in sorrow and in hope. God then responds with so much, such outrageous, such unrestrained, so much abundant love and joy to meet that repentant one because of God's righteousness. Because of God the Father's abundant love for each and every one of us. Amen. I'm going to invite you to pray together with me now, using the words on the screen to that great prayer that Jesus taught us, where he compels us, encourages us to call God our Father, Abba, Daddy. Let's pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as in heaven. Give us today our daily bread. Forgive us our sins, as we forgive those who sin against us. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For the kingdom, the power, and the glory are yours, now and forever. Amen. My friends, as always, thank you for watching. You're always welcome to join in with St. Stephen's in whatever way you're able or willing. If anyone wants to get in touch with anything that's come up this week or at any point and have someone to talk to them, pray with them, please do get in contact. Details should all be on the websites and church Facebook group. Details of those are at the end of this video. Until we meet again, my friends, go in peace to love and serve the Lord. In the name of Christ. Amen.